June 14th, 2024. Maple Ridge Correctional Facility sat under a gray Alabama sky like a concrete tomb. At 6:02 a.m., the first bell of morning count echoed through the halls, a dull metallic clang that usually stirred the noise of women waking, arguing, or praying. But that morning, there was nothing. No footsteps, no voices, just silence thick enough to make the fluorescent lights hum louder than usual. Officer Carla Hayes had worked the overnight shift before. She'd seen chaos, fights over stolen soap, screaming meltdowns, the sharp panic of alarms. But she had never seen stillness like this. As she turned down Block G, she noticed 4-cell doors standing wide open. Her heart tripped. Inside each, a woman lay sprawled on the floor. One hand frozen mid-reach. Another curled against the wall. Their eyes were open but glassy, their skin pale against the gray concrete. Carla's radio slipped from her hand. "Control, this is Unit G," she whispered. We've got 4 down." Within minutes, the corridor exploded with movement. Sirens, boots, shouted orders, but it was too late for all of them. The paramedics confirmed what Carla already knew. For women, for bodies, no signs of struggle, no visible wounds. Just lifeless forms and a handful of crumbs scattered near their bunks. When the warden arrived, he ordered the area sealed off. The official word spread quickly through staff radios. Possible food contamination. By breakfast, it was being called an unfortunate coincidence. The press release would later label it a tragic night inside an overcrowded facility. But to Carla Hayes, it didn't look like coincidence. It looked like murder. The victims' names were entered into the system before the sun was even up. Sharon Bell, 31, former nurse, serving 8 years for manslaughter after killing her abusive husband. Amani Davis, 29, single mother, sentenced for credit card fraud. Lucinda James, 35, once a high school English teacher caught in a drug trafficking bust she swore she knew nothing about. Danielle Moore, 33, diagnosed with postpartum psychosis, imprisoned after her infant's accidental death. For women from 4 different worlds. But by 7 a.m., their bodies were zipped into the same kind of black bag and rolled down the same hallway. As the crime scene techs photographed the cells, Carla lingered near Sharon Bell's bunk. Something didn't add up. On the floor was a crumpled napkin and half a cookie, still glistening with grease. She frowned. Sharon hated sweets. She always traded her desserts for fruit at chow. So why would she eat this one? Carla slipped on a glove, picked up the cookie, and placed it inside a tiny plastic evidence bag she carried out of habit from her Army days. No one saw her do it. In Maple Ridge, silence wasn't just expected, it was policy. By 8 a.m., the facility was locked down, and whispers began crawling through the cell blocks. They all died the same night. Same block, same officer. They was pregnant, you know. That word, pregnant, made Carla stop cold. She'd overheard similar gossip weeks earlier, but dismissed it as inmate drama. Now it returned like a ghost. Down in the administrative wing, the warden, Daniel Reeds, held a short press briefing. He called it an unfortunate series of unrelated medical events and reminded his officers to avoid speculation. But Carla could read the unease in his voice. Even he didn't believe it. She spent the next hours walking the block alone, eyes tracing every detail, for cells, for bodies, for half-eaten cookies. And the same man on duty during each death, Sergeant Damon Locke, a 20-year veteran everyone respected, the kind of man who always stayed calm when others panicked. He was already writing the incident report before the coroner left. When she passed him in the corridor, he gave her a reassuring smile. "Rough night, huh, rookie? Don't overthink it. These things happen." But there was something in his eyes, flat, measured, unbothered, that made her stomach twist. That night, long after the shift change, Carla sat her car in the prison lot, hands gripping the steering wheel, listening to the ticking of the engine. Somewhere inside those walls, for unborn children had died alongside their mothers. And everyone was acting like it was paperwork. She looked down at the small evidence bag in her pocket, the cookie crumb catching the light of the dashboard. "Not this time," she whispered. In Maple Ridge, silence was survival. But that morning, Officer Carla Hayes decided silence would no longer be her language. It was the morning 4 mothers died, and the moment one woman began to fight for their voices. Every prison has stories the walls try to swallow. At Maple Ridge, the walls had learned to keep secrets. But the 4 women who died that night, Sharon, Imani, Lucinda, and Danielle, had each left behind traces of their truth. Fragments of hope, guilt, and fear scattered in journals, folded notes, and whispered prayers no one was meant to hear. Sharon Bell had once been a nurse in Birmingham, known for her calm hands and her bright smile. But calm didn't save her the night her husband came home drunk with a knife. The coroner called it a fatal stabbing. The prosecutor called it murder. Sharon called it survival. In prison, she wore her guilt like a cross she couldn't take off. She volunteered in the medical wing, helped inmates with minor injuries, and attended every therapy session. The guards liked her. The chaplain said she had found peace. But inside her cell, her journal told a different story. I still want to be a mother again. Maybe it's crazy, but I think God's giving me one more chance. The entry was dated 1 week before her death. No one, not her mother, not her lawyer, not the prison nurse, knew she was pregnant. Only one man did. Sergeant Damon Locke. Imani Davis was the youngest of the 4. 29, single mother, caught in a loop of bad decisions and desperate needs. Before prison, she'd worked 3 jobs to feed her son, Zaire. When bills stacked higher than her paycheck, she stole a stranger's credit card. That one mistake cost her 5 years of her life. But Imani never lost her spark. Other inmates said she had a laugh that could fill a room. She earned her GED, sang in Sunday service, and kept a picture of Zaire taped above her bunk, a boy with big eyes and a gap-toothed grin. Then one day, she stopped smiling. She stopped eating. The change was sudden and sharp. A prison nurse, Maria, pulled her aside and whispered, "You didn't hear this from me, okay? But it's a boy." Imani cried for hours that night. Not because she was scared, though she was, but because for the first time in years, she felt something like purpose again. "You're going to have a brother, baby," she whispered into the dark. "Someone who'll protect you when I can't." She began writing letters again, letters she'd never get to send. In one, found later in her property box, she wrote, "He told me not to say a word. Said if I did, they'd move me to isolation. Said he'd make sure I never saw my baby. But I don't feel safe. If something happens to me, it wasn't an accident." Lucinda James was different. She'd been a teacher, the kind that stayed late grading essays and bringing snacks for kids who couldn't afford lunch. Her fall came out of nowhere. Wrong car, wrong boyfriend, wrong day. When police found fentanyl in the trunk, Lucinda took the blame rather than testify against him. It was loyalty that cost her freedom. Inside Maple Ridge, she became the unofficial tutor. She ran writing workshops for other inmates and helped them tell their stories. But when the pregnancy test came back positive, the words stopped flowing. She didn't panic. She didn't cry. She sat at her metal desk, opened her notebook, and wrote a single line. Maybe God doesn't erase. Maybe he rewrites. Lucinda wasn't naive. She knew the rules. Pregnant inmates were transferred, examined, questioned, and punished if the father was staff. She knew Damon Locke would deny everything. But she didn't care. For once, she had something that was hers. The last words she ever wrote were found scribbled on the back of a torn Bible page. "Tell Carla." And then there was Danielle Moore. She didn't talk much. Didn't have friends. Most of the women thought she was strange, maybe even dangerous. Her file said postpartum psychosis. The headlines had called her a monster, a mother who smothered her child. What the headlines didn't say was that she had been screaming for help for weeks, and no one answered. In prison, she withdrew into herself. The only thing she tended to was a tiny plant she'd grown in a styrofoam cup. A single green sprout she named Grace. Every morning, she'd whisper to it, her voice barely audible over the hum of fluorescent lights. 2 nights before she died, she scratched 4 words into the underside of her metal bunk. "I will not vanish." When Officer Carla Hayes read their files later, she couldn't shake the feeling that these women were connected by more than coincidence. For pregnancies, all undisclosed. for inmates assigned to the same night shift, for deaths within hours. She looked at their photos. 4 women society had written off as broken, sinful, disposable. But in each of their stories, she saw something else. Courage, defiance, humanity. Carla leaned back in her chair, eyes burning from the fluorescent light, and whispered to herself. They tried to survive, and someone made sure they didn't. If you asked anyone at Maple Ridge who the most reliable man in the building was, they'd say the same name every time. Sergeant Damon Locke. He'd been there for 20 years, longer than most wardens, longer than half the staff. He walked those gray corridors like he owned them. Calm voice, crisp uniform, clipboard in hand. He was the man the rookies went to for advice, and the one the warden trusted to keep things running smooth. To most, he was a rock. To the women of Block G, he was a shadow that never left. Damon Locke understood the system better than anyone. He knew when the cameras were serviced, when the night rounds were unmonitored, which nurses were too tired to question a missing pill bottle, which inmates didn't have lawyers or families to call for help. He didn't need to raise his voice to control people. He controlled access. It started with small favors. A second bar of soap, extra phone time, a snack from the staff pantry. He knew how to make it seem like kindness, like privilege. Then came the manipulation. You're special, he'd tell them through the bars. You can trust me. By the time they realized those favors came with strings, it was too late. Carla Hayes saw it before she understood it. She'd been at Maple Ridge less than 6 months when she first noticed how often certain inmates, Sharon, Imani, Lucinda, and Danielle, were assigned to Damon's shift. He always volunteered for overtime in Block G. He never swapped shifts, never called in sick. Routine, he said. But Carla noticed the routine always centered around the same women. At first, she told herself she was overanalyzing. Damon was respected, even liked. He trained her during her first month, taught her how to file reports properly, how to avoid getting manipulated by inmates. He'd even brought her coffee once, told her, "You'll do fine here, kid." But as the weeks passed, the coincidences piled up. She'd see Sharon return from inventory duty late at night, eyes red, lips trembling. She'd see Imani in the laundry room long after her shift ended, folding the same towel over and over, as if trying to keep her hands busy. Lucinda stopped attending her writing workshops. Danielle stopped singing to her plant. For women, all once vibrant in their own small ways, suddenly quiet, withdrawn, hollow. And every time one of them changed, Damon was there. Carla began studying him the way a soldier studies an enemy. She watched how he touched the key ring on his belt, a small, idle habit, but one he did whenever a woman walked past. She noticed how he leaned just slightly too close when giving instructions, lowering his voice until it wasn't authority anymore. It was intimacy disguised as control. Then there was the paperwork. Damon Locke's reports were flawless. Too flawless. Every incident logged on time. Every logbook initialed twice. No missing signatures, no gaps. It was the kind of perfection only a guilty man could maintain. Inmates whisper about him in code. They called him Mr. Night Shift. And when Carla asked one of them, an older lifer named Nina, what that meant, Nina looked her dead in the eye and said, "Means if he likes you, you don't sleep much." That was the night Carla started keeping her own notes. Hidden in the lining of her locker, she wrote down every time Damon volunteered for extra duty, every inmate reassignment, every random camera outage. One pattern stood out. June 13th. All 4 victims were placed on Locke's block that night. All 4 received a late-night snack delivery. All 4 died before dawn. The following morning, when the bodies were found, Damon didn't flinch. He was the one who radioed it in. Calm, methodical, no panic, no grief. Just another box checked. He even offered to help carry the gurneys out. When questioned by investigators, he blamed contaminated food. He suggested the cookies had gone bad or been mishandled by kitchen staff. He wrote the official incident report himself, ending it with the line, "All procedures followed, awaiting autopsy results." To the administration, it sounded professional. To Carla, it sounded rehearsed. Later that day, she walked past him in the corridor. He smiled, warm, polite, almost brotherly. but his eyes didn't match his face. "You look tired, Officer Hayes," he said. "This job can eat you alive if you let it." Carla stared back, her pulse hammering in her ears. "Some things are worth being eaten for." He chuckled softly, then leaned in just enough for her to smell the faint trace of coffee and peppermint on his breath. "Careful, rookie. Curiosity can be dangerous in this place." As he walked away, the sound of his boots echoed down the empty hall, slow, steady, unhurried, like a man who knew he was untouchable. And maybe he was, because in Maple Ridge, men like Damon Locke didn't need to hide their crimes. The system hid them for him. In a prison like Maple Ridge, silence wasn't just the rule, it was survival. But after 4 women turned up dead, Officer Carla Hayes decided she'd rather risk everything than live one more day, pretending she didn't see what was right in front of her. For a week, she tried to play by the book. She waited for internal affairs to show up. She filed her observations. She even approached her shift supervisor, a man who told her, without looking up from his desk, "You're new, Hayes. Don't make waves. Let the process work." But the process wasn't working. It was burying the truth. Every night, Carla went home and couldn't sleep. When she closed her eyes, she saw those women, Sharon's open eyes, Imani's trembling hands, the outline of the cookie on Lucinda's floor. She couldn't shake the feeling that they had been silenced, that someone, him, had made sure of it. So she started digging, quietly, smartly. She checked the logbooks again, the ones Damon Locke had filled out himself. They were perfect, too perfect. The timestamps matched down to the minute, but the handwriting told a different story, deliberate, copied, mechanical. She photographed every page with her phone, emailing the files to a private Gmail account she'd set up the night before under a fake name, June Justice 84. Next, she checked the kitchen records. Only one person had volunteered for snack duty that night, Damon Locke. It wasn't unusual for him to hand out treats to the model inmates, but the timing lined up too neatly with the deaths. Carla remembered the cookie she'd taken that morning. It had been sitting in a sealed plastic bag on her kitchen counter ever since. So she did something no correctional officer was supposed to do. She took evidence off-site. That weekend, she stopped by the infirmary when the day nurse was on break. She borrowed a test kit, the kind used for detecting chemical residue on contraband. When the results came back, her stomach dropped. Positive for thallium, a tasteless, odorless metal toxin, once used in rat poison, now banned for consumer use. A few crumbs could stop a heartbeat in hours. She printed the report, tucked it into her vest pocket, and went straight to her supervisor. He read it in silence, eyes flicking between the paper and her face. Then he leaned back in his chair and said flatly, "That's above your clearance level, Officer Hayes. I'll take it from here." She hesitated. "Sir, with all due respect." He cut her off. "You've done enough. Leave it alone." By the next morning, her locker had been searched. Her shift assignment had been changed. Her clearance access to the surveillance system had been revoked. They weren't investigating her findings. They were erasing them. That night, she found a black car parked outside her apartment. It sat there for 3 nights in a row, engine off, tinted windows. On the 3rd morning, she woke up to an envelope slid under her door. No return address. Inside, a single printed photo, Carla holding her 5-year-old niece's hand outside a daycare center. On the back, scrawled in thick black marker, "Kids are easy targets. Keep your mouth shut." Her blood went cold. She didn't call the police. She knew how that would go. The department would open an internal review, and the evidence would vanish into red tape. Maple Ridge protected its own, so she got smarter. She changed her route to work, switched grocery stores, and moved her niece to a different daycare. She started wearing a hidden body camera under her jacket, a cyclist model she'd ordered online. She kept her own logs, printed 2 copies of every document, and mailed them to friends out of state just in case. But paranoia wasn't enough to quiet the rage. One night, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the thallium report under the yellow light. For women dead, for unborn children, and a system pretending it never happened. Her phone buzzed, a message from a name she hadn't seen in years, Naomi Vega. They'd served together overseas. Now Naomi was a journalist in Montgomery. Carla typed slowly. I have proof that 4 pregnant inmates were murdered inside Maple Ridge. It was covered up. I need to talk. Naomi called 5 minutes later. You're serious? Carla's voice didn't tremble. Dead serious. They met the next night in a half-empty diner off Highway 82. Carla slid a USB drive across the table. Every log, photo, letter, and test results she collected. Naomi listened, barely blinking. If half of this checks out, she said finally, you're sitting on the biggest prison scandal in Alabama's history. Carla nodded. Then let's make sure nobody buries it. Outside, the rain started to fall. Carla watched the water slide down the diner window, her reflection split by streaks of light. She wasn't just a guard anymore. She was a witness, a whistleblower, a target, and she knew the storm was only beginning. The deeper Officer Carla Hayes dug, the clearer one thing became. Maple Ridge wasn't just hiding evidence. It was destroying it. Every time she found a lead, it vanished. Logbooks were lost. Reports were misfiled. Autopsy requests came back, pending indefinitely. It was like the system was scrubbing its own skin clean, one layer at a time. But there was one man who hadn't forgotten what he saw. Dr. Leonard Washington had been the prison physician for 6 years. Tall, soft-spoken, always with tired eyes behind his wireframe glasses. Most staff saw him as harmless, the kind of man who stayed out of drama and buried himself in paperwork. They were half right, because Leonard Washington had been keeping secrets too, not to protect himself, but because he didn't know who else to trust. When Carla showed up outside his office one morning with a manila folder tucked under her arm and a storm in her eyes, he knew she wasn't there for small talk. I think you already know what this is about, she said, closing the door behind her. He hesitated. The 4 women. Carla nodded. I need the medical files. The real ones. He exhaled long and low. They're gone. Then how do you know they existed? Because I wrote them. He told her everything. He noticed the irregularities months before the deaths. Missing pregnancy test results, unfiled lab work, blood panels labeled invalid. When he asked about it, the head nurse gave him a look he would never forget. A warning without words. Some things, she told him quietly, aren't worth losing your license over. That's when he realized this wasn't a clerical error. It was control. Someone was deciding who got to be seen, who got to be believed, and who got to disappear. The last time he saw Danielle Moore, she had come into the infirmary pale and dizzy. He'd seen that look before, the lightheaded exhaustion of early pregnancy. He wrote a note in her chart, ordered prenatal vitamins. The next morning, the entry was gone, deleted. When he asked the medical administrator why, she simply said, administrative oversight. He never asked again, until the night he zipped 4 body bags. Now, sitting across from Carla, he opened his desk drawer and pulled out a USB drive wrapped in an old handkerchief. I kept copies, he said quietly. Everything they tried to erase, scans, medication logs, test results. I didn't know what to do with them, but I think you do. Carla turned the drive over in her hand like it was a weapon. One file caught her attention immediately. A note written in Dr. Washington's own handwriting, dated 2 weeks before the deaths. 4 confirmed pregnancies. None documented. Patterns suggest coercion by staff. No safe channel for escalation. She felt her chest tighten. You knew. I suspected, he corrected softly. But I didn't have proof. Not until now. He handed her a final folder. 4 personal letters collected from inmate belongings. Letters that had never been mailed. Sharon's letter was addressed to her mother. Tell Kyla, I still believe I can be the mother she deserves. There's a little life growing inside me, and I swear I'll protect it this time. Imani's note was to her son. Baby, I'm scared. The man who says he'll help me makes me feel smaller every day. If I don't make it home, don't ever think Mama didn't love you. Lucinda's handwriting was precise, almost teacher-like. I've been documenting everything. Times, names, touches. If I vanish, it wasn't because I gave up. It's because someone made sure I couldn't tell my story. And Danielle's, written in shaky pencil on notebook paper. He comes late. Says I'm lucky he cares. Says if I talk, I'll lose the baby too. Carla's throat closed. These weren't just letters. They were confessions from the grave. Each one confirmed what she already suspected. Damon Locke had used his position to prey on the women he was paid to protect. And when they started finding their voices, he poisoned them. She looked at Dr. Washington, eyes burning. "Why didn't you come forward?" He gave a bitter half-smile. "Because I didn't think anyone would listen." "Well," she said, standing up, clutching the USB drive, "I'm listening." That night, Carla drove home with the rain pounding against her windshield. She kept glancing at the passenger seat where the folder rested, letters peeking out from under the flap. At a red light, she opened the glove box, pulled out a small notebook, and began writing names. Sharon, Amani, Lucinda, Danielle. For women. For mothers. For voices the system tried to erase. Now she had their words, their doctor, and a paper trail that could burn Maple Ridge to the ground. As thunder rolled above the highway, she whispered, "You wanted silence, Damon? Then you're about to hear them scream." The night Officer Carla Hayes met journalist Naomi Vega in that dim diner off Highway 82, something irreversible began. By the time a waitress brought their second cup of coffee, Carla had handed over everything. USB drives, letters, test results, scanned reports from Dr. Washington's files. The truth about Maple Ridge was no longer a secret. It was evidence. Naomi leaned back, staring at the drive. "You realize," she said quietly, "once this goes out, there's no putting it back." Carla nodded. "Good." They started carefully, verifying every detail. Naomi contacted medical experts, cross-checked dates, and even hired a digital forensics specialist to examine the prison's internal system logs. Within 48 hours, he confirmed it. 5 cameras on Block G had not malfunctioned. They had been manually shut off at 11:02 p.m. on June 13th. The override command came from a console in the control office. Only one person had access to that panel, Sergeant Damon Locke. But the most damning piece came from an off-site backup file, a small grainy clip captured by an old, forgotten surveillance subfeed. 17 seconds long. The video showed Locke pushing a cart down the corridor, for trays neatly lined with cookies and milk cartons. He stopped at each of the 4 cells. No sound, no struggle, just efficiency, the kind of smooth, calculated movement that only comes from a man who's done something terrible and done it before. When Naomi watched the clip, she whispered, "My God, he planned it to the second." Carla just nodded. "He always does." The next step was to expose it. Naomi spent 3 sleepless nights writing the story, triple-checking every line. And on the morning of August 2nd, 2024, the headline exploded across digital screens. 4 pregnant inmates murdered in Alabama prison cover-up. Whistleblower speaks out. The article hit like a bomb. Within hours, it spread from local blogs to CNN, MSNBC, and Reddit crime threads. The hashtags #MapleRidge4, #Justice for Women, and #Her Sentence Wasn't Death began trending nationwide. Outside the prison gates, the quiet road leading to the facility filled with protesters, mothers, social workers, former inmates, clergy. Some carried baby shoes, others held cardboard signs that read, "They were mothers. They were women. They were human." A 63-year-old retired social worker named Rosa Milner laid 4 teddy bears at the main gate and told a reporter what happened, and there wasn't neglect. It was annihilation. By day 2, the crowd had doubled. By day 3, it reached the state capitol. Civil rights groups demanded an independent investigation. Faith leaders called for federal oversight. Former inmates flooded social media with testimonies about sexual coercion and retaliation in prisons across the South. One tweet read, "This isn't just Maple Ridge. This happens everywhere." They just got caught. Inside her apartment, Carla sat on her couch, surrounded by silence, watching the story take on a life of its own. Naomi called her every few hours with updates. New whistleblowers, new interviews, new survivors speaking up. For the first time in months, Carla allowed herself to exhale. She'd done it. She'd broken the silence. But she also knew the system would fight back. The Alabama Department of Corrections issued a formal statement calling the allegations reckless and unfounded. They placed Carla on unpaid administrative leave for violating chain of command. Her badge was suspended. Her name leaked online. Commentators called her a liar, a disgruntled officer, even a traitor. Naomi warned her it was coming. "They'll try to make you the villain," she said. "It's what institutions do when they're scared." Carla didn't care. "As long as they're scared of the truth," she replied. Within 48 hours, the state attorney general announced a joint investigation with the FBI's Civil Rights Division. Federal agents descended on Maple Ridge. Files were seized, computers imaged, and for the first time, Damon Locke's calm mask began to crack. He didn't show up for his next shift. By Friday morning, his house was under surveillance. When agents approached, he stood in his doorway with that same polite smile he'd worn for years. "Gentlemen," he said, "this is a mistake." It wasn't. They led him away in handcuffs as cameras flashed. That night, the image hit every news network. A man once praised as the model officer, now pale and hollow-eyed in a beige county jumpsuit. The headline read, "Sergeant Damon Locke arrested, 4 counts of murder, 4 counts of sexual abuse of inmates, obstruction of justice." Carla watched the broadcast from her living room. No celebration, no relief, just quiet vindication. She whispered, almost to herself, "You thought no one would listen, Sharon. They're listening now." Outside her window, Montgomery buzzed with protest chants and camera lights. But inside, the air was still. Carla reached in her pocket and pulled out one of the folded letters. Lucinda's handwriting, faded and fragile. "If I vanish, it's because someone made sure I couldn't tell my story." Carla traced the words with her finger. Then she looked at the TV again, at the image of Damon being led away, and whispered, "You told it, Lucinda. The whole damn world just heard you." The trial of Sergeant Damon Locke began on a cold Monday morning in November 2024, nearly 5 months after Maple Ridge Correctional Facility became a national headline. Outside the courthouse, the air buzzed with tension. Protesters held candles and handmade signs. Cameras lined the steps. Every major news outlet in America had sent someone to cover the case that had come to symbolize everything broken about the prison system. Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of wood polish and nerves. Damon sat at the defense table, his once pristine uniform replaced by a gray suit. His hair was thinner, his jaw harder, his eyes empty. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man convinced the system that once protected him might still do it again. Across the aisle sat Officer Carla Hayes, her hands clasped tight in her lap. She'd been subpoenaed as the state's key witness, the whistleblower who had dared to break the silence. To her left was Dr. Leonard Washington, quiet, stoic, clutching the same folder of medical evidence he'd once hidden in his desk drawer. The prosecution called it the most egregious abuse of authority in Alabama correctional history. The defense called it a tragic misunderstanding. But when District Attorney Karen Mitchell stood to deliver her opening statement, the room fell silent. These women were not accidents. They were targets. Each of them was carrying evidence inside her body, proof of an officer's crimes. And when that officer realized exposure meant the end of his career, he silenced them all. For weeks, the prosecution built its case piece by piece, each witness hammering a nail into Locke's coffin. Dr. Washington testified first, his voice low but unwavering. All 4 pregnancies were confirmed. All documentation was deleted after my entries were made. Only one person had the authority and access to remove those records, Sergeant Locke. He handed the court the flash drive with the missing medical files. The jury watched as screenshots of erased pregnancy reports flashed on the courtroom screen, time-stamped and traced to Locke's login credentials. Then came the digital forensics expert, who verified the manual shutdown of the Block G cameras. The backup footage, that 17-second clip of Locke pushing his snack cart, played in slow motion. The room held its breath. You could hear the faint squeak of the cart's wheels, the way his hand rested on each cell door, the calm rhythm of a man completing a task he'd already rehearsed in his mind. When the lights came back on, several jurors looked visibly shaken. Locke's defense attorney, a smooth-talking former federal prosecutor named Mark Ellison, tried to dismantle the narrative. He argued the cookies were contaminated by tainted prison supplies, not deliberate poisoning. He suggested the pregnancies could have been consensual relationships between inmates and outside contractors. He even implied Carla's motives were personal, citing her disciplinary record and the suspension that followed her whistleblowing. "Miss Hayes," he asked during cross-examination, "isn't it true that you violated direct orders, leaked confidential files, and stole prison property?" Carla didn't flinch. "Yes," she said clearly, "because when I followed the rules, 4 women died. And when I broke them, the truth came out." The courtroom murmured. Even the judge paused before telling the gallery to remain quiet. Then came the letters. The prosecution introduced them one by one. Sharon's to her mother, Imani's to her son, Lucinda's note about documenting everything, and Danielle's trembling confession written in pencil. Each was displayed on the overhead screen. Each read aloud by a victim advocate with a voice that cracked only once. When the last line, "He says if I talk, I'll lose the baby too," echoed through the courtroom, Damon Locke shifted in his chair for the first time in days. Prosecutor Mitchell turned to him and said, "Those were your words, weren't they?" He didn't answer. On the 14th day, the defense called Damon himself to the stand. A risky move, but Ellison had no other cards left. Damon spoke smoothly at first, painting himself as a dedicated officer betrayed by his colleagues. "I served that facility for 20 years. Those women trusted me. I never hurt anyone." But under cross-examination, the mask cracked. Mitchell leaned forward. "Then explain the thallium found in the cookies you served. Explain your fingerprints on the tray. Explain why you deleted medical records and disabled cameras." Damon's composure faltered. "You think I wanted this? They were out of control. They threatened me. They said they'd ruin me." Mitchell's tone sharpened. "So you ruined them first?" His jaw tightened. Silence. Then, for the first time, he looked directly at Carla across the room. His voice dropped to a whisper that carried anyway. "You think you're hero, Hayes? You'll see. The system eats its own." The judge struck the remark, but the damage was done. The jury had seen his true face, the arrogance, the menace, the predator behind the uniform. When a verdict came on December 12th, 2024, the courtroom was packed. The jury forewoman stood, voice steady. On all counts of murder in the second degree, guilty. On all counts of sexual abuse of inmates, guilty. On charges of obstruction of justice and evidence tampering, guilty. Carla exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for 2 years. Locke didn't move as the sentence was read. Life without parole. Dr. Washington bowed his head. Naomi Vega wept quietly in the press row. And Carla, the rookie officer who had once been told not to make waves, finally let her tears fall. As officers led Damon from the courtroom, he paused at the door, turning to face the crowd one last time. For a moment, it seemed he might speak. Instead, he smiled, small, bitter, almost pitying, before disappearing through the exit. Carla whispered under her breath, "You don't get to erase them." That night, the world watched the story unfold on the evening news. Anchors spoke of justice, accountability, systemic failure. But for Carla, justice wasn't a headline. It was 4 names carved into her memory: Sharon, Imani, Lucinda, and Danielle. Their voices had finally been heard. When a verdict was read and the cameras finally stopped flashing, it felt like the world moved on. But for Officer Carla Hayes, the story didn't end when Damon Locke was sentenced. It was only beginning. In the weeks after the trial, Maple Ridge Correctional Facility stood half empty. The state declared it under review, though everyone knew that was just a polite way of saying shut down. The hallways where the 4 women had lived were stripped bare, cells cleaned, names painted over. The walls looked sterile again, as if the place was trying to erase the memory of what had happened there. But memory has a way of lingering, even in concrete. Carla returned one last time, walking down Block G with the same flashlight she'd carried the morning she found them. The doors were locked open now, permanent reminders of silence that had cost too many lives. At Sharon's old cell, she stopped. Someone, maybe another guard, had left a single paper crane on the floor. At Danielle's, a small sprout pushed up between cracks in the cement. A weed, maybe, or something stronger. She whispered into the empty corridor, You're free now." Then she turned off the light and left Maple Ridge behind. Outside those walls, the world was changing. Naomi Vega's article had become a movement. Civil rights groups rallied under a new banner, the Grace Act, named after Danielle's tiny plant that had survived even when its owner hadn't. The bill called for 24-hour surveillance in all women's correctional facilities, independent medical oversight, and protection for whistleblowers. It took 8 months of hearings, protests, and relentless testimony. But on August 7th, 2025, the Alabama State Senate passed it unanimously. At the signing ceremony, Governor Allen stood before the cameras and said, "This law is for every woman who was silenced when she deserved to be safe. It is for the four who can't speak for themselves, and the one who refused to stay quiet." Carla watched from the back of the crowd, sunglasses hiding her tears. By then, she no longer wore a uniform. After the trial, the Department of Corrections restructured. Her reinstatement never came. Some said it was politics. Others said it was punishment. But Carla didn't care. The badge had been a shield once. Now, her voice was enough. With Naomi's help, she founded a nonprofit called the Grace Initiative, a support network for incarcerated women and whistleblowers inside correctional systems. They worked out of a modest office above a laundromat in downtown Montgomery. No marble plaques, no polished floors, just a wall of photographs and 4 small frames at the center: Sharon, Imani, Lucinda, and Danielle. Below them hung a wooden sign Naomi had carved herself. They were mothers. They were women. They were human. Every week, letters poured in from across the country. Women sharing their stories, officers confessing what they'd seen, families thanking Carla for giving their daughter's memories dignity. One envelope came from a little boy in Detroit. It was Imani's son, Zaire. Inside was a drawing, 4 angels holding hands around a bright green plant. Beneath it, he'd written in shaky block letters, "For my mom and the ladies who helped her find peace." Carla pinned it next to her desk. Some nights, when the weight of it all felt too heavy, she looked at that picture and reminded herself why she'd started. The following spring, a candlelight memorial was held outside what remained of Maple Ridge. The facility had been sold, its gates welded shut, but that night the front lawn filled with more than 300 people. Former inmates, journalists, nurses, clergy, and ordinary citizens who'd followed the story from the beginning. Naomi read Lucinda's final note aloud, her voice trembling through the microphone. "If I die in here, let it be known I was more than my worst day." Then, one by one, candles flickered to life across the field until the darkness glowed gold. Carla stood at the front, holding a small pot. Inside it, a cutting from Grace, Danielle's plant. She set it down on the soil where the old foundation used to be. "This," she said softly, "is for every woman they thought they could bury, for every story they try to silence. Because the truth doesn't die. It grows." The crowd repeated her last word, "grows." And for a moment, the air was still, like the world itself was listening. Later that night, Carla sat alone in her car, engine off, the stars reflecting in the windshield. Naomi texted, "You did it." Carla smiled faintly. "We did." She reached in her pocket and unfolded one of the original letters, the one Lucinda had written to tell Carla. The paper was creased and faded, but the ink still glowed faintly under the dashboard light. "If this ever reaches you," Lucinda had written, "don't let them call us victims. Call us proof that courage exists, even in chains." Carla read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it back beside the potted plant on her passenger seat. As she started the car, dawn was breaking, thin gold light cutting through the Alabama fog. The radio murmured in the background, news of another investigation in another state. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But for the first time in a long time, Carla didn't feel afraid. She felt purpose, because somewhere out there, 4 voices she'd once thought lost were still echoing, in laws rewritten, in women who refused to stay silent, in the whisper of leaves on a small green plant named Grace.